Hey everyone, welcome back. In this tutorial, we'll be adding particle effects to the game and replacing the kind of placeholder debris that we set up previously with proper debris particles instead of objects. But before we make the particle object and start making systems, I'm just going to add some new sprites in. So I've got some new sprites that you can use if you want, and we'll just add them to our existing sprites folder. We'll just drag them in. As you can see, I've got a couple different ones for the ship debris, which is what the enemy and player ships will be using, the ship exhaust, and also the asteroid debris. And before I do anything else, I'm just going to center all of their origins. Just so when we create them, they'll be anchored at the center. Great, so that's the sprites we're going to use. Feel free to make your own, by the way. And now we are going to make our new particle system kind of object. So this is going to be kind of like our game object and our camera object. It's going to be a persistent object that will be created only once and then persist throughout the game. So I'm going to tick persistent, and before I forget, I'm actually just going to add it to the room start. We'll just drag it in there. Okay. So let's come over to the create event, which is where we are going to be creating all of the particle effects. So if I type in particle right here, we can kind of see all of the different blocks available to us. There is more as well available in the GML, which I encourage you to explore if you want to make even more kind of changes to the particles. But these are great and they will do just fine for our game. So now the first thing we have to do is just create basically a container for the particles. It's called a particle system, and a particle system can hold all of our different types of particles. So this is just how GameMaker does it. You just have to remember, if you're going to be creating particles, you first have to create the particle system. And you can kind of apply system-wide effects to the particles. So, for example, we can clear all of the particles in a system from the room, which we will want to be doing, for example, when we restart the room, because we don't want our old particles to persist in the room. So we'll have a look at that a little bit later, but it's just something to keep in mind. All right, so the first thing that we'll do is we will create our particle system. I'm going to rename this as part sys for particle system. And now we can go ahead and create our particle type. So let's make part type for particle type exhaust. All right. Now, as you can see, there's lots of changes that you can make to particles. So you can change its speed, the lifetime, which is kind of like how long the particle will exist for. You can change its colors, the directions that it moves, and even its transparency. There is a lot that you can look up, and I encourage you to have a play with these. I'm going to present what might seem like an arbitrary bunch of numbers, and it's just kind of what I've arrived at messing with the system myself. But particles are really something that you should tinker with, because often even small changes in numbers can create pretty big effects on the appearance of the particles, so definitely have a play. The first thing that I'll want to do is just set the sprite. You can actually set a shape for the particle as well, and there are some built-in shapes that you can use. So we just want to put in the particle type that we just created, and then we want to set its sprite. So remember, this is going to be the exhaust. So we'll click on that. And now we're just going to set a few other things. So I'm going to set its size. And I'm going to get it to kind of start off small and then get larger. So remember, put part type exhaust in here. I'm going to start it off at 0.4, and I'm going to increase it every frame by a small kind of number. You want to be careful of some of these increasing values, because in a short amount of time, you might find that it increases a lot. So these ones are often best kept to the decimals. And this wiggle, it's kind of like the camera shake. It's going to make it kind of shake erratically between a couple numbers. I might not do that, but it might be something fun that you can have a play with. All right, next we're going to set the particle color. And we'll just paste in the type. Now for the player, just because I think it goes with the aqua color scheme, I might start it off as white. Then I might set it to a kind of fuchsia pink color, and then to purple. Again, have a play with those though. It can be really fun to mess around with. Next, I'm going to set its alpha. So this is going to change the transparency of the particle. I'm going to have it be 1 for the most part, but just when it's about to be destroyed, I'm going to have it fade to 0 so it doesn't kind of abruptly disappear. And finally, I'm going to set its life. I'll have these only stick around for a little bit of time, so I'll do 20. So these are in frames, not seconds. So 20 frames, which will be kind of a third of a second. And you might want to set these to variable amounts. So like you can have a range of what it's going to be destroyed between. I'm just going to keep this constant because I think the exhaust looks nice like that. But that will be it for just that one particle type. By the way, when we're creating these, because we're about to create a lot more, it might be handy to organize them. So what you can do is highlight all of these and you can actually add a comment. And I'm going to call this one player exhaust. So all of this is to do with the player exhaust. Because honestly, the enemy one is going to be very similar to this. I'm basically just going to change its color. So we can copy all of these. Whoops, from here to here, copy paste, and I will change this to be enemy exhaust. It will use the same sprite actually, and well, you could feel free to alter any of these if you want to make the enemy particles look a bit more imposing. Maybe you do want to use a different sprite, feel free to make your own. I'm just going to change the colors though. So I'm going to have the enemies. Since they're red, I'm going to have it start off as, let's do yellow. I'll have it go to orange. And then finally it will fade out to red. Alright, and now we just have to remember to call this something different. So I'll call this part type enemy exhaust and be sure to replace all of these. Great. Before we go any further, I just want to point out that particle systems require their own kind of cleanup. When we create them, they don't get destroyed automatically. You have to pick when you want to destroy them. So that might be at the end of a room, it might be when an object is destroyed, you might have no use for the particle anymore. So if you don't need the particles, make sure you destroy them. We kind of want the particles to persist throughout the entire game, so I'm only going to get rid of them when this object gets destroyed, so I'm going to put it in its cleanup. So this gets run whenever the object gets destroyed. So in here, what we want to do is destroy the particle system. And remember, we call this part sys, and we also want to destroy all of the particle types. At the moment, we've only made 2, and we'll put those in. So it was part type exhaust and part type enemy exhaust. And we'll have to add the rest when we're done. Now, another little bit of cleanup that we want to do is, like I kind of mentioned earlier, we want to be clearing the particles when the rooms restart. I don't want the debris particles, for example, to appear on the win or lose room or when we restart the game when the player dies. So I want to add on the room end. So when the room ends, I want to clear the particles that are there. So again, you can type in particles to have a look at all the different particle blocks, but the one we want is called clear particle system. So that's going to clear any particles part of this system, which all of our particle types are, from the room. And before we go any further making some of the debris particles, I'm just going to test the player exhaust and the enemy exhaust. So let's come over to the OBJ ship. Now in here, when we are pressing the up key and we're propelling ourselves through space, this is where we will be creating the particles. And the block that we want is called burst of particles. So as it says, it creates a burst of particles without an emitter. And we haven't messed with emitters yet. They are a way that you can kind of emit a steady stream of particles, but that's not something that we're going to look at in this tutorial. Now, because we don't have access to any of the particle systems variables, I'm just going to straight away apply this to OBJ particles. So now we can refer to its part system, and I want to be using the part type exhaust. Now, the X and Y position will have to get outside of this because it will have to be supplied by the ship. We can change the count though. I only want that to be 1. Now we'll have to set up where the player is creating it. So I'm going to make some temporary variables so that we can refer to these even inside the scope of the particle system. So we will make them temporary or local variables. So I'll call the first one XX and the second one YY, and that's what we'll put in here. So I want to make these equal to the current position of the player, so the X and Y. But if I do that, that's going to be creating the particles right in the center of the ship, which is maybe not what we want because that's not where the exhaust should really be coming from. It should be coming from the rear of the ship. So I'm going to add a kind of vector amount to the X and Y, just like we've done before for the bullets, to offset this by a certain amount. So we will use the length dir X. So remember that those functions require a length and a direction. We do know the direction and we can set up a length. And I'll do that external to this. So we could just put that above this one. I might just do it here though. The length I'm going to make roughly half the sprite because that would kind of offset it all the way to the left. But I don't want it maybe all the way to the left because the back of the ship is a little bit over from that. So I might just multiply it by 0.4. So that will get it quite far over, but not all the way. All right, cool. So now I can use that argument in here. So length and the direction, I could put image angle, but that would mean it would be going in the same direction as the player ship. So it would offset it to the front of the ship, which is not what we want. So we want to subtract 180 so that it goes behind it. So we will subtract 180. And that's all we need to do. And we'll do the same for the Y. Actually, I've mistyped the function name, so it's length dir X and length dir Y. And it will pass over those arguments into here for the burst of the particles. Before I do that in the enemy ship as well, I might just test it within the player to see if that looks good. So there we go, our exhaust is working. Now, I think that looks pretty good, but to me, it looks a little bit more like a coil than exhaust. The particles look too connected, and that's probably because too many are being created one after each other. So we want to break it up a little bit, and we want to only create a particle every few seconds, maybe. So just like how we had set up a counter for the enemies when they create the bullets, we'll do the same for the exhaust. So we'll come over to the create event of the player. I'm going to add a new variable. And this will be a counter. And I'll call this exhaust counter. We'll start at 0. And in here, what we'll do is we'll have the exhaust counter be ticking up every frame. So exhaust counter, we're adding 1 relative to whatever it currently equals. And then we just want to check if exhaust counter is larger than some kind of value. So you can set this to whatever you want, depending on the speed you want the player to emit the exhaust. I'm going to put 3. I think that looks pretty good. And then we just have to drag these over into the if statement. And we also want to make sure we're resetting that exhaust counter so that it keeps ticking upwards. Great. So now if we run that, we should get a different look for the exhaust. So there you go, it's a little bit more spaced apart. I think that looks a lot better. So now let's set that up for the enemy. We can actually copy over basically all of this because I want it to work the same in the enemy as it does in the player. So let's copy over all of this. We'll also have to set up the exhaust counter in the enemy object. Let's come over and we'll do it in the parent enemy, I think, because they're all going to be having some exhaust. We're going to put it in their step event. Now, the only change that we'll want to make is the type of particles that they're emitting. So we don't want the player's one, we want the enemy exhaust. And we also want to just, of course, set up that exhaust counter. Something to keep in mind is you might want to be checking if they are inheriting from their parent. Luckily, I think we did already set this up the call parent event in the create and step event of all of our enemies, but if you're making changes to a parent, it might be good to check if the children are actually inheriting. Alright, so let's give that a run and have a look at the enemies. So there we go, we can see the enemies are creating their own exhaust. So now we are going to keep setting up the rest of our particles. Let's head back to the particle system and we can start working on some of the debris. So we'll be doing the ship debris for the enemy and the player, and also the asteroid debris. So let's just set up the names for now. So we're going to have part type asteroid debris. We'll have part type ship debris for our player, and we'll also have part type enemy debris. And before we do anything else, we will of course assign the sprites for each of these. So in here, we'll set it to the asteroid debris, which is this one. For the ship debris, I'm going to assign it to the ship. And for the enemy, we'll assign it to the enemy's one. We'll also assign it to the ship. Now, I think what I might do is speed up me making all of these particle types and setting up all of their settings. I encourage you to also have a go at messing with all of their settings. Don't just stick to the shape and size and color. You might want to change the speed at which they move. You might want to start them off really fast and then slower as they go on to kind of simulate the effect of an explosion. So have a go at that, and when we come back, I will explain the changes that I've made to all of them. Alright, so what I've done for the asteroid debris is I've changed its alpha. So over its lifetime, it's going to start at 0.8 and 0.8. So it's actually going to be a lower transparency than most objects. And I just did this because I want the debris to be distinguishable from the rest of the asteroids that we can actually blow up. So then it fades out into 0 as well. Its lifetime is 60 to 80 frames. Its direction is anything from 0 to 360. And as well, its orientation or its kind of image angle is going to be the same, 0 to 360. Its speed, so it's going to start moving off in those random directions at a speed of 2 to 2.4, and then it's going to decrease by 0.02 over its lifetime. Again, I've kept that number quite small. For the ship debris, it's quite similar. So I've set its color to be the ally color. I've set its size. I've given it similar alpha rules, same lifetime, same kind of orientation and direction. I've tweaked its speed to be a bit faster than the asteroid as well, to make it kind of more explosive. And I've done the exact same for the enemy debris. I've just basically changed its color. But feel free to change those more so that they're actually distinguishable from each other. It might be more exciting to have the factions look quite different. But I'm going to leave it there for now. So let's actually start creating these particles. I'm going to head over to the ship and I'm going to copy what we had before when we were creating the particles here. I'm going to copy these, and in its destroy event, which is when we would be creating the debris, in here I will paste that in. I'm going to get rid of this because I am happy for the debris to be created relative to where the player is in its center. So that's fine. I'm going to copy this, although actually I might change this to 10 and I want to change the type to the ship debris. All right, and then I want to copy this and I'm going to put it in the enemy, so in the parent enemy, because I want all of the enemies to do a similar thing. So in their destroy events, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make that temporary variable. It's going to be applied to the particle object. I'll make 10 as well, but I want to make the enemy debris. All right, over to the asteroids. So like the camera shake, I might tweak these depending on the size of the asteroid. Now, I might firstly just paste it out here because I want all of them to have access to this temporary variable. I don't have to repeat and put it inside every if check. I just have to cut this part and put it in here. So in the huge one, I want to create the asteroid debris, and let's make 12. And then I'll copy that, scroll down to the medium one, and I will paste it here. Let's make just 8. And finally, the small one. Let's make just 4. All right, so I think that's all the particles set up. We should be good to just test it and see if everything works. So there we go, we can see the asteroids are exploding and the ship exploded as well. So there we go, it's looking a lot more visually dynamic, and we can see also that our player ship exploded with its own debris. Alright, so I think we're done. The ships will have their exhaust, the debris particles are working, and I think it's looking really nice. So, as I said, definitely have a play with all of those particle variables. It's really fun to set up particle systems and get the feel of the game just right, and you can really only get the hang of it if you experiment. But that is it for this run of the Space Rock series. Congratulations for making it this far. We've covered a lot of content, and I encourage you to keep building on this project if you want. There's tons more that you could do with it. You could revisit our factions and add, say, allied ships that help the player, neutral ships that only become aggressive when someone attacks them. You could add even more power-ups, or perhaps lasting ship upgrades, even more particle effects. Or perhaps you might even feel comfortable enough to tackle some entirely new systems. So different goals for the player and different levels of the game. But that'll be all from me for now. Thank you so much for watching and coding with me, and maybe I'll see you in another tutorial. Bye for now.